Hello and welcome to 15 Minutes in Canberra. I'm Hayley Channer, Senior Policy Fellow with the Perth US Asia Centre. My guest today is Katja Theodorakis. Katja is the Head of Counterterrorism with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, otherwise known as ASPI. Before joining ASPI, Katja was Senior Program Coordinator for Research and Analysis for a German think tank based in Canberra called the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation. So not only can Katja speak on counterterrorism issues, she also has a firm grasp of European defence and security matters. Katja has lived in the Middle East, where she was engaged in educational projects and NGO work in Syria during the early years of Bashar al-Assad's presidency. She holds first-class honours degree in international development from ANU and is the recipient of several scholarships, including an Australian Government Research Training PhD scholarship. Katja, welcome to 15 Minutes in Canberra.
Thank you, Hayley, and thank you to everyone for listening. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, you've had an incredible career trajectory. Not only have you lived and worked in the Middle East, but you also have had some time growing up in Germany and also living in the United States. Tell me, how did you get to become the head of counterterrorism with an Australian think tank?
I really like how you phrased the question. I mean, it's very flattering, but usually my tendency is, no, it's not like this, not incredible. I like how you phrased it because it's pretty much the life trajectory, right? So I've never really separated the two. I've always, I guess, what I wanted to do is always very much tied to who I am and what I'm interested in. And I think that's maybe the road that took me here. Because I didn't know that I would end up in this place in counterterrorism. I started off.
You weren't a little girl dreaming of being a counterterrorism analyst?
No, I wanted to be so many things. It was between a writer and a doctor. I nearly joined the military for an officer's career. But I was told that at the time that there probably wouldn't be a big war because I wanted to be some great, medic that was saving people on the front lines and do humanitarian aid. And I was told that because there's not really a war on the horizon, that I would probably just do a whole lot of logistics and just give people vaccinations or deal with injuries and training. Obviously, this was before 9/11. This is a little bit of a clue of how old I am, but it was 99. So they're like, look, unless you're prepared and you're really in it for this, maybe just go and do some aid work or maybe, think about this war correspondent thing you've been talking about. And a year later, I think I would have found myself, or 2 years later in Afghanistan probably. But, it's interesting, which is kind of I phrased it the other day about a career span. I said, well, sometimes it's the road not taken that gets you to where you end up. But it all comes together in a way that maybe it actually matches your original ambitions. You just wouldn't know. So I have that sense of, I've always been interested in these things. They could have been expressed in different career trajectories because I'm interested in people. I'm interested in conflict, what makes human nature go to those extremes that you feel like that war or political violence is the only solution. So I think that's maybe the red thread. And then you just pursue those interests. And, when you're 18 or 19, at least for me, I would have had really clear ideas about what I'm interested in, what I like, but not so much about how to get there.
And that's why, too, counterterrorism must be a perfect fit for you because it is the intersection of so many different aspects of personal relationships and international affairs and security and I guess, to dynamics between groups and politics and special interest groups. I guess
special interest groups. I love how you put that.
So
sounds like a knitting circle.
This is slightly different.
Yeah.
So in the last few months, we've seen the US withdraw from Afghanistan, and obviously things really deteriorating badly in Afghanistan. Even though President Biden and the former President Trump had flagged the potential for the US to withdraw, I don't think anyone was predicting it to be as bad as it was or to go as chaotically as it did. What's your assessment of the current state of affairs in Afghanistan at the moment? And if you could have done something differently in terms of the withdrawal, what would that have been to create a better outcome than what we saw?
I thought about this question a lot since you'd sent it and I have to say, I think my reaction is very much colored by how I feel about how tragic the situation is and that it's goes back to not just one mistake. I mean, there was obviously so many miscalculations in the lead up to the withdrawal. Even the smallest things done differently would have made such a big difference in your narrative and in your, just to show that you care. And I think I was particularly shocked that a US president that after Trump, who came with so much humanity, he brought so much humanity to it, to the job, and like the inauguration and the poems that were read and the sincerity that exuded, and having been vice president before where he could, he could have tested his assumptions, which he did, and to be so, I think, careless in the execution and sort of ignorant or indifferent to the consequences that, you wouldn't actually, you say, okay, do you really want to end Afghanistan, which is so emotionally charged for so many people, even domestically, not let alone all the Afghans. Do you really want to end this with a drone strike where you're taking a risk of collateral damage that's a little bit higher than in your average drone strike just because the situation warrants it? That kind of, there's this exception, this state of exception that warrants for violence to be legitimate. I think that logic, that came bearing down in the last days. And I just a few days ago read an article in The Guardian that said, the national security risk from Afghanistan to the United States is still so high. So again, that was I think it was a defense spokesperson who said that. For that to be your driving logic, that yes, there was nation building and it was about freeing women and children and little girls being able to go to school. That is there and it's sincere. But then when you boil it down in those soundbite statements, it's all about national security. And I think that's where I think has to be greater awareness, not just of your strategic communication. I really don't like the term. Because I think the humanity that you need to have, that could come out better.
I want to shift from talking about the Middle East and counterterrorism to looking back at your previous role with a German think tank here in Canberra, which had a Europe focus, because, we're in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm interested to know what the European take is on our region and why European countries have an Indo-Pacific strategy and why they're interested in our own region. I mean, you have countries like France that have territories here, and the United Kingdom has long-standing historical ties with the region. But why is it that Europe, who's on the other side of the world to us, has an Indo-Pacific strategy? What's their idea about how to engage in our region, particularly when they're still faced with challenges like a resurgent Russia?
There's a number of factors. And again, the way you've framed the question is really significant, because the EU strategy, which was released in September this year, or strategic framework, sort of came after a number of key EU nations by themselves had developed their own strategies. France was first, which, as you said, makes sense as actual resident power in the Indo-Pacific and significant defense ties, and actually, and the UK. But it was the Netherlands before that, and it was, which seafaring nation, you could say, and, former Indonesia as a former colony. But Germany was a bit of a surprise. And they don't have a strategy. They have a policy, they have policy guidelines. And it's quite interesting.
Not quite a policy, but just guidelines.
Guidelines. And I think that's very tentative. But at the same time, it's putting a foot forward. And so those individual policy documents came first, and that as leading nations in the EU, and that kind of gave momentum for the EU to develop a strategy.
And was the drive behind a lot of those national strategies about economic opportunities that were in the region, or was it more security engagement, or was it sort of a whole picture of different things?
So that's the interesting thing. You have to analyze them individually and then compare them, because each nation will have different interests, and it comes down to their role, to what they perceive as the two superpowers that are competing, and how they want to be aligned or not aligned. The EU as a whole, they follow, I think they call it the Sinatra doctrine themselves. They said, well, we did it our way. We will not.
I never heard the Sinatra doctrine.
So this was actually the EU foreign policy chief who coined that phrase. And he said, we'll do it like Sinatra, we'll do it our way. We do not want to be caught up in this, and we have beef with both superpowers, but we also want to have good relations. And that's a spectrum, and each nation had a different relationship. So the French and would be a lot more security oriented and would see China more as a strategic rival and competitor. Because the EU said the same, EU Foreign Policy Chief Borrell, he also said, we're aware that, China is not just one thing. It's an economic partner, but it's also a strategic rival and a competitor. And we need to have a policy that reflects all three, which is a pretty tall order, especially when you have so many member states with different interests. But Germany, I would say, would be more on the cautious side. They do not want to alienate China. And Chancellor Merkel said at Davos last year, she said, we do not want to choose sides. And that statement, that's quite telling. There's obviously the automobile industry, which has a huge stake, and the relations with China economically are a lot more important for other nations. They have different economic interests, but it was quite telling in the sense that she said, well, these two superpowers have their issues, and we do not want to get caught in the middle because they've both done things that we don't agree with, and we need to just forge our own path. But I think that's quite tricky because one is an ally, and there has been long-standing the transatlantic relationship is that's a really key pillar, or should be, of European, not just security, but also of a value orientation. And then you have China, and you have genocide going on, you have human rights violations, an authoritarian one-party state, and the chancellor of, the leader of the free world, aside from the US president, will come out and say, we don't want to choose sides. I think she didn't mean it quite like that. It wasn't meant to be this
black and white.
Yeah, but I think that's quite telling where Germany is at. So in their policy guidelines, they define the Indo-Pacific as a center. They will be this pivot for the rules-based order. And there's quite the influence.
So Europe is seeing what happens in our region to do with the rules-based order as having not necessarily direct, but definite implications for how rules and norms are promoted within Europe.
Absolutely. And so I think it was in the EU strategy, it would be more comprehensive. I think it would be saying that the Indo-Pacific is the world's economic and geopolitical hub. And they saw this shift of gravity, and they realized they have to get a stake in there because, this is kind of the engine of the world now, and there has been this shift. And because of that systemic competition between the US and China, I think the understanding was that if the EU doesn't get a stake, then they will be left behind. You can't just rely on your individual relationships with countries, bilateral. And the EU, they have done a lot in terms of multilateralism, with ASEAN supporting, various projects, and their connectivity framework, which is kind of a bit of an alternative to One Belt, One Road. So it builds in a lot of prior engagement, but it's really interesting in terms of France would probably focus a lot more on its strategy. It's also called a strategy, which was released by the Defense Ministry and another security relay. That was sort of I think the focus was a lot more on geopolitics.
More the security side.
Absolutely. Whereas Germany, it's come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with input from the Defense Ministry. And I think that input is really important as well, even though it's focused a lot more on diplomacy and good ties, and the future of the rules-based order will be decided in the Indo-Pacific. This is how the German guidelines.
I've always found that fascinating because a big part of me is confused about why Europe is so interested in our region. And whenever Australia is looking to partner more with European countries, I think, are we missing an opportunity to partner more with countries in our own immediate region? Because for so long we've been accused of having, more interest in our old traditional partners and less of an interest in being more active partners with countries in our own neighbourhood. So I will really look forward with interest to see how Europe engages in the region and how it can be a net force for good. So, Katja, we have gone all around the world, it feels like.
Thanks to your questions.
So we got from Middle East and looking at Indo-Pacific and also in Europe. I wanted to ask you lastly about your career and reflecting back on the times that you've had. Sometimes in our field, there can be weird things, or you find yourself in certain situations you never expected. Do you have a story like that you'd like to share?
Yeah, and it brings me back to, the focus on the EU. So it was My last trip before the pandemic broke out, my last overseas trip, found myself in Brussels with Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation conducting several dialogues. And it happened to be the time of the EU summit, where Boris Johnson made his final pitch for Brexit, and the fate of Brexit was actually decided. And we happened to be staying in the same hotel with Chancellor Merkel, which we didn't know at the time because we'd booked years, like months in advance.
Too,
so we didn't know. And the security wasn't ostentatious. I don't think we found out actually until that all those politicians from the summit were, very close to us. And so on the last day, I think there was a lot of security in the hotel, but we sort of worked around. And the last day, I was trying to get the elevator down. I was running late, and I had a delegation waiting. I was like, oh no, I kept pressing the button. I was like, I really need to go. Elevator finally came, and there was a gentleman in there, 3 gentlemen actually. And the 2 gentlemen were like, no, we need to keep going. And the gentleman in the middle, who was flanked by these other 2 gentlemen, he was like, no, come in. And I was like, oh, that's so nice, thank you, because I'm really in a rush. And then I looked up, they were all very, especially the 2 flanking him, they're very tall. And I was like, and you have those little wires coming out of your ear? And right, this is a very important politician, and you are security. And so I was racking my brain on the way down because I was having a chat. I was like, who is this? And it only dawned on me that he must be really important.
Deadly female assassin that they
I know, right? They were notably nervous that he had just gestured that I could come in, and they were like, oh, no. And I was like, please, I really need to go. Which sort of it says something about actually just the humanity or the normalness of this politician. So I thought maybe he's just a low-level politician. Turned out to be I think the Prime Minister of Finland at the time. But it was quite interesting because we got out of the lift, and that's when I realized, because there's a lot of press waiting and the security was going out. So I just kind of waved at everyone, walked past, a little red carpet. And
and the story was Finnish Prime Minister caught with rogue female.
And I could see it also in the face of my boss who was waiting for me, the way I was walking out of the elevator and I was waiting. So that's sort of my story. I thought it was great because it actually goes to show that when you do train for things like your elevator pitch, that could be career changing. I did not seize upon this moment. I just was having a nice chat with the lovely gentleman.
Yeah.
But it brought me back to, earlier moments when, that elevator pitch, it's a thing.
Yes. I mean, everyone says, I'll get you a 3-minute elevator pitch because you never know who you're going to be in an elevator with. And I used to laugh at people who said that. But it is true. You don't know who you're going to find yourself next to when you go to these major conferences, because people have to stay somewhere and everyone has to use the elevator or meet you in the brunch hall or something. Katja, thank you so much for taking time to go through your career and all of the experiences you've had, as well as your expertise on counterterrorism and also Europe's defence and foreign policy outlook. It's been very valuable, and I know that listeners would really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for this great forum.